The Byzantine Empire never actually existed. I know, it sounds completely impossible, right? But the truth is, almost everything you were taught in school about the dramatic fall of Rome in 476 AD is a historical invention. It's a myth. The Roman Empire didn't just vanish into the Dark Ages.
So, think about it for a second. If the Byzantine Empire is a complete myth, what exactly survived in the East for another 1,000 years? Who were the people building these massive domed cathedrals, fighting off continuous invasions and preserving ancient knowledge? What we are looking at here is quite possibly the greatest historical cover-up in Western education.
Welcome to the hidden reality Rome never actually fell. Today in this explainer, we're going to dive right into the hard evidence, the laws, the taxes, and the incredible survival mechanisms to uncover an unbroken 2,200-year history.
Part 1. The Lie of Byzantium. To really understand the truth, we first have to establish the status quo. We're all super familiar with the standard narrative, right? Rome fell to barbarians in the 5th century, the classical world ended, and Europe plunged headfirst into the Dark Ages. We treat that as an absolute, undeniable fact. But the primary sources, they tell a wildly different story.
The sheer scale of this deception is honestly staggering. The reality is that the eastern half of the empire just continued thriving, and its people called themselves Romans all the way to the very end. They were legally, certifiably Roman citizens. So why the new name? Well, centuries later, Western Europeans rebranded these surviving Eastern Romans as Byzantines. Why? Mostly to claim the cultural genealogy of Rome for themselves. By pretending the Eastern Romans were just Greeks, the West could legitimize its own brand new empires.
Let's move on to Part 2, the 2,200-year timeline. We really need to shatter our standard historical timeline here and look at the actual mind-bending chronological scale of this single political community.
Just look at this timeline on the screen. Let the sheer visual length of this sink in for a moment. We're going from a small city-state founded in 753 BC through the Republic into the imperial monarchy, shifting the capital to Constantinople in 330 AD all the way to 1453 AD. That is over 2,200 years of unbroken continuity. There's no rupture here. It is one continuous historical narrative, one political organism evolving very slowly over time. That's a massive aha moment right there. Rome wasn't just a city anymore. It had become this incredibly resilient system.
Which brings us to Part 3, the edict that changed everything. The crucial question is, how on earth did a system survive that long? How do you evolve from a single Italian city into an entity that outlived the classical era by a literal millennium? Well, we need to peel back the layers of evidence to pinpoint the exact moment the empire's DNA changed forever.
And this document brilliantly illustrates that moment. In 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniana. This was a massive edict extending full Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the entire Roman Empire. Suddenly, being Roman was no longer tied to being born in the city of Rome or even in Italy. It became a shared political identity tied to a legal and administrative system. And they didn't just say it for PR, they actually implemented it. Within a generation, the most powerful people in the empire were all coming from the provinces.
This wasn't just elite posturing, it had a very real human impact. Look at the before and after comparison here. Post-212 AD, you've got universal citizenship and equal access to Roman courts. For example, historical records show Jewish women living in the East purposefully taking their disputes to Roman courts rather than local rabbinical ones. Why would they do that? Because imperial Roman property laws simply granted them better rights. The empire functioned because the law actually functioned for its people.
Part 4. Rome's Perpetual Referendum. Now, don't let all this talk of laws and courts fool you into thinking this was some peaceful utopian society. It absolutely wasn't. Let's shift gears and look at the brutal political tension of the era. Because to understand Roman longevity, you have to understand the everyday, visceral dangers of leading the Roman state.
I want you to ponder this information gap for a second. Why would a Roman emperor, a guy commanding massive armies and wielding theoretically absolute power, be absolutely terrified of a crowd of ordinary citizens?
Well, here is a terrifying data point to consider. 46%. Nearly half of all emperors ruling from Constantinople were violently overthrown, mutilated, or murdered. The Roman Empire did not have a strict hereditary right to the throne. Anyone with enough backing could take it. Civil wars weren't a bug in the system, they were a feature.
Because there were no modern elections, the Roman state relied on what historians call a perpetual referendum.
Look at how the Hippodrome in Constantinople actually functioned. You gather 30,000 to 100,000 citizens in the stadium. The emperor appears, the crowd either violently cheers in support or loudly boos him. They demand policy shifts. In one really famous instance in the 1190s, an emperor tried to impose a new German tax, but the crowd in the Hippodrome revolted so fiercely he had to immediately backtrack and cancel the whole thing. If an emperor ignored this feedback loop, the crowd would trigger a riot, a coup, and he would literally lose his nose or his head.
So, when the government blasted out messaging that they were sleepless, working tirelessly on behalf of their citizens, it wasn't just empty propaganda. The gap between their rhetoric and their actions was surprisingly small, mostly because their physical survival depended on it. They had to deliver stability or they would be violently replaced.
Which brings us to Part 5, Constantine's masterstroke, and honestly the climax of this whole investigation. If the system was this unbelievably volatile, how did it survive an era of extreme, empire-ending chaos? To figure that out, we have to look at the men who fundamentally hacked the survival of the Roman state.
Because before the empire could thrive, it almost died. Welcome to the 3rd century crisis. It was the perfect storm. 26 emperors were murdered in just 50 years. There were non-stop civil wars. Hyperinflation completely ravaged the economy, and a devastating plague was killing up to 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. The state totally fractured. By all accounts, it should have ended right there.
But Rome didn't fall. It executed a brilliant reset. First, Emperor Diocletian stabilized things by creating a massive universal tax bureaucracy. He essentially built an ancient deep state that censused every taxable asset to properly fund the armies. Then, Emperor Constantine arrived and executed 2 absolute masterstrokes. He moved the entire capital to the east, and he began the centuries-long process of integrating Christianity into the imperial system as a deeply powerful, unifying cultural force.
And the sheer geographical genius of moving the capital was unparalleled. Look at this comparison. Old Rome was vulnerable, pagan, and super far away from the active military frontiers on the Danube and the Euphrates. New Rome, Constantinople, was a strategic fortress clamped perfectly between Europe and Asia. It was impossibly wealthy, and it forced the Eastern elites to invest all their money and political power into one unified Senate. Constantine didn't abandon Rome. He simply copy and pasted it into a much safer, significantly more strategic neighborhood.
This whole thing forces us to confront a wildly different perspective on history. What if the so-called fall of Rome wasn't a fall at all, but rather the most successful corporate restructuring in human history? The Western branch became unprofitable and undefendable, so they just liquidated it and focused entirely on the highly profitable, highly secure Eastern branch.
Part 6, The Ship of Theseus. This brings our investigation to a profound philosophical conclusion. Because think about it, if they changed the religion, moved the capital, and completely updated the laws, is it still Rome?
To answer that, we really have to look at the ancient paradox of the ship of Theseus. If you have a ship at sea, and over hundreds of years you gradually replace every single wooden plank, every sail, and every nail until none of the original physical pieces remain, is it still the same ship?
Look at the extremes of our timeline. A 1st century Roman was a Latin-speaking, toga-wearing pagan. A 10th century Roman living in Constantinople was a Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian managed by a massive tax bureaucracy. On the surface, the cultural components look entirely different. If you put them in a room together, they might barely recognize each other's daily habits.
But, as historians point out, at no point is there a rupture in that history. It is still the exact same ship. The political consensus to be ruled by Roman law, the overarching taxation system, the continuous historical narrative, and the unbreakable belief that they were the Roman people, that never broke. The planks changed, for sure, but the vessels sailed on, unbroken for over 2 millennia.
Which leaves us with a lingering, kind of uncomfortable thought to end on. If the fall of Rome and the Byzantine Empire are fictions designed to simplify history and protect modern political narratives, what else have we been taught that is completely wrong? Well, if you think this historical cover-up was wild, the truth about how we've misjudged the technological brilliance of the ancient world is even harder to believe. But that is an investigation for our next explainer. Keep questioning everything.